Welcome to the Teacher in Classroom 21, a podcast by the Ever Learner. I'm James, your host. Join me and my guests every week as we discuss, debate and explore the features of a world-class classroom in the 21st century. Welcome, listeners, to the Teacher in Classroom 21 podcast. I'm your host, James Sims, and I'm privileged to welcome this week Scott Livingston from Montreal, Canada. Scott is renowned in the field of high-performance sport as an expert in strength and conditioning, movement dysfunction, and athlete reconditioning. Scott has worked in elite sport for approaching 3 decades, recently specializing in the process of integrating high-performance coaching with therapeutic practice. Creator of his high-performance sport business, husband to Jamie and father to Gretchen, Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, James, for having me on your show.
I'm extremely excited about this. I think it's going to be really fascinating. I want to take you back, I think it's 3 years. Oh, no, sorry, a little bit longer, to a stint where you've been away from home for 3 years. And I'd like to know whether your return to Montreal and to Canada from your ventures in the northern United States was a homecoming. And if it was a homecoming, how did that feel?
It was a homecoming of sorts in the sense that I actually went through, you wouldn't get this in any of the information you would have read, but I'd gone through quite a stormy period of time in my life when I was down in the States. I was in New York and at the time married to another woman and got divorced while I was down there while I was working for the New York Rangers and the New York Islanders, professional hockey teams. And I actually lost my job with the Rangers. The GM decided he was going to change directions. And so I was out of a job, out of a marriage, and looking for work. And so this job came up with Montreal Canadiens, which are like the Manchester United of hockey. And it was actually a team that, as I grew up, I hated. I was a Boston Bruins fan, so I was like a Liverpool fan, but I was now going to go work for Man U, and so I had taken this job, and I was very excited about the opportunity to come home and reconnect with friends and family and things like that. And so, yes, it was a wonderful return, but at the same time, there was a lot of comings and goings in my life.
Do you recall the journey that you made? I mean, was it in a car, a van? Did you fly back in? Do you recall that? And if you do you recall the sentiment? Did you arrive back in Montreal thinking, I'm home and this is permanent? Did you arrive back thinking, I'm home and this is a stint? How was that?
It's a good question. I did drive because I had to pack all my stuff in a box van, I think, and drive home, and then refabricate my life. I recall being sort of lost at the time because I had to sort of find my footing again. Obviously, after a divorce, you're kind of not really sure where life is and what you're doing. And it represented sort of a grounding point because I had good friends, but I had to figure out how I was going to live, where I was going to live, what I was going to do. And but I had this new job. And so, you're thrust, it's more of a feeling of, whoa, let's go, because I was going back and I was going right into another job, right into a different cultural experience with a new team. And so there was a lot of new stuff, a lot of expectations around trying to find an apartment. And I had made some decisions as well because when I was in the States, I commuted every day into work. It was about an hour and a half. I used to live in Connecticut and drive into New York City. So for your viewers, this would be like living, way outside of London and driving into the center of London every day, or your audience, and then driving back afterwards. And so I figured at one point that I spent 26 days a year in my car. And
wow.
So when I came back to Montreal, I was intent in finding an apartment very close to the office. So I found myself this really cool loft, and I became a bachelor for a few years. And so it was an exciting time for me, really.
How does your commute today compare to that one?
Well, it was my commute today was from upstairs in my house downstairs here. It depends on the day, but when I do go into the office in Montreal, because I actually live in Mont Tremblant, which is a ski village about an hour and a half north
Yeah.
of Montreal. I moved there a while ago, and I do go in once a week, and that is about an hour and a half. But I make it very comfortable for myself. I listen to podcasts, I listen to audiobooks, and I usually stay in the city and have a nice dinner with a friend and catch up, and then come home. So it's a different life for sure.
Wow, it's really interesting. So effectively, if you've got a working week of 5 days, you've got 4 days working from home, and you've got one day and one night where you're down in the city in the office. And is the office you're working in? What sort of scale and size team is that? How many of you are there?
We have a 10,000 square foot gym. It's in the gym business. It's kind of a boutique style
Mm,
gym that is very not. It's a non-membership based gym in the sense that you don't buy a membership and pass a card to get in the space. It's very much a community oriented space. Most of the clientele have a relatively high net worth. You've got what I call executive athletes. You've got performance athletes of all kinds, and some Olympians, et cetera. So it's a kind of a unique environment. And we have about 35 people that work for us. Some are personal
wow.
trainers, some are clinicians of all types. And then we have some administrative team. And we have a very cool elite cycling system that one of my partners built called Power Watts that is kind of the juggernaut of revenue generators for our business model.
I see. Tell us a little bit about Power Watts. That's
Power Watts is a cycling system that my partner Paulo Saldana developed. He started it basically. Anybody who's listening that's a cyclist would probably know the Compy training software. And essentially, what happens is CompuTrainer built, which actually has gone out of business now, but they built a rear wheel force system that basically had a braking capacity, and it was run by software. And you would put your road bike on this, and you could ride and change gears and effectively feel to a degree like you were riding outside.
I see.
So Paulo took that system and basically put 8 bikes in a room, and then he would switch people's bikes in and out. So he had at one point a room where he probably had over 150K worth of bikes in the room, and they would switch them in and switch them out for classes. That was when I first met him. And so then what he did was he created a spec bike that you just changed the seat set and the headset setting, and then created a software. And now it's really very high tech where you go into the class and each person has their own speedometer and they work at their own load, and there's 10 people working. It's pretty cool.
So one of the things that comes through really strongly from you, Scott, both in the things that you've said so far today, but also in my reading around your work and your life, is high performance is clearly, and I mean athletically, but more broadly as well, that high performance is clearly an important feature of your work and of your life. So in your work with, so our listeners know, as you mentioned before, you've worked as strength and conditioning coach at really elite level NHL hockey teams, the Islanders, the Rangers in New York, as you mentioned before, Montreal Canadiens, also with the B210 Olympic program as well. So working with, and you've got some great stories of that also on your own podcast. But my question to you is, what is elite performance? What is high performance to you and to your eye? I guess in sport, we can kind of see it. It's aesthetic to a degree. But in your mind, does it go beyond the physical? Is it behavioral? Is it psychological? Is it sociocultural? What is high performance?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess it's a mindset in the sense that you eliminate the limits or limitations or perception of limitations by use of various means. That can be money, that can be intellect or intellectual property, it can be innovation, it can be the integration of high performers together in a group working around a project. But you're essentially trying to create an environment where limits are taken away to the best of your ability, and the sky is the limit in a sense that you remove those barriers to really achieving whatever it is that you want to achieve. So, you can look at a NASA space project as a high performance project, somebody trying to build a huge industrial project in Dubai is a high performance project, trying to run an elite sports team is a high performance project. And every one of those to some degree has certain perceived barriers to success. And in some instances, people think that they're running high performance organizations, but they're actually not removing the impediments or not thinking in a truly high performance way. So I've actually found in high performance sport that it is a rarity to some degree that it is truly high performance. Everybody would say that it is, but there are always impediments to success and the moments that people actually brainstorm and think through and varying ways to succeed. I would say something like F1 racing is true high performance. And it doesn't always have to be a monetary cost to it. It's really in a mindset to a degree.
So extracting some of it sounds to me like you differentiate between high performance and peak performance. And what kind of interests me within that is with the range of athletes that you've worked with and looking at the barriers that you've tended to see, to what degree have those barriers been physical things that perhaps are really tough to change? And to what degree have they been things like psychological processes, self-limiting beliefs, assumptions? How does that balance out in your experience?
Well, I think it's a continuum that if you want to talk athletes as an example, most athletes, as they rise through a process of becoming true elite athletes and have a success in whether it's professional sport or Olympic sport, go through a call it climbing of a mountain that in a process of arriving at true elite status. And that usually covers through your physical limitations, your possibly financial and structural limitations around the resources you have to actually be successful, whether that's engaging the right kind of coach or the right performance team members around you, etc. And then you move up to, and really the thing that differentiates the cream of the crop from being winners and just about being winners is usually mindset and mental performance. And that's become more and more clear in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years of elite sport performance. So if you look historically back, and it would probably be true of elite football or elite rugby in England, and it would be true of elite hockey and football back in, would say the 70s and 60s, 70s, and early 80s, there really wasn't much physical conditioning other than what was integrated into the sport practice field. So there was a lot of room for growth and development in that zone. And so I would say between about 1985 and 2005, that was the growth curve for performance. And so now the next growth curve that you're starting to see is that mental performance piece. But it was almost until that got exhausted, people didn't necessarily take the leap of faith to get into the mental side of the game.
Yeah, it's almost like that sigmoid curve idea that the curve rises and sooner or later it's going to flatten out and plateau, but you have to find that next curve to travel on. Mm-hmm. It's a really fascinating one. I'm also fascinated in the work that you do. That one of the things I perceive is that diagnostics, whether it's in movement dysfunction analysis or whether it's in strength and conditioning coaching, diagnostics would appear to be a very, very central feature of your work with athletes. Is that a fair thing to say? And if so, what is the role of diagnostics in your work?
Well, it's interesting that you use the word diagnostics because I actually do what I would call the counterpoint of a true diagnostic proposition. So if you look at a medical practitioner or a classic therapeutic approach, what is used is a diagnostic approach that is sort of a funnel methodology assessment. So if you come in to see me and I look at you and I look at your you've got shoulder pain or something, so I'm going to do an examination and I'm going to go through a series of tests. I'm going to do a history and all this stuff, and at the end I'm going to come and I'm going to name that tune. I'm going to say you have a shoulder tendonitis of some sort, and I'll name the tissue that's giving you problems. And really, what I've come to understand more and more in my practice is what I do is more of what I call a holistic profile of the entire body and look at cause and effect.
I see.
And I try not to name that tune, but I try to understand why this problem is occurring. So if the problem is occurring because you actually have an issue in a left foot that you never cleared up from an ankle problem many years ago. And it's not always clear that you can make the leap of faith that they're connected, but the thought process is if you can clear the impediments to movement, you will take the stress off of the tissue that's getting stressed, and you want to better understand why that tissue is being stressed. So at the end of the day, rather than having a diagnostic proposition, which usually then ends up having some simple intervention, whether that's, drug oriented or specific, exercise or whatever, we look at it much more from a global perspective and all the different factors that you want to clean up.
So it's that potential range of causalities that ultimately you're interested in looking at. And I think that is a fascinating point, because how many times would we go, as you said, with a sore shoulder? Okay, in my mind, I'm probably thinking more of a general practitioner doctor, and we look, okay, it's sore there, the muscle is so the tendon is rubbing, or whatever it happens to be. And as you said, we treat it in that way. We treat that symptom where the cause may well be something much more underpinning, something much more foundational, which has led to that experience in the shoulder. And
as an example, not to interrupt you too much,
but please.
To link into some of the world that you're in with education, you will have kids that come into school with potentially attention deficit issues. Maybe they're not focusing enough. So you might do a diagnostic assessment and then name whatever issue it is that kid's having. Whereas if you tend to take a more global viewpoint, that issue might be driven by nutritional issues, post-concussion that maybe wasn't picked up in a history, the mindset or stress points that are going on in the child's life, et cetera. So the typical examination would be much more sort of, okay, let's name that tune based on a few very, simple rubrics versus really looking globally at what's going on in this kid's life. And you look at the concussion, concussion is a much bigger thing these days, and we're noticing that concussion changes mood, changes ability to focus, et cetera. So you'll have a kid who goes and plays a soccer game and gets an incidental concussion. Nobody knew about it. And all of a sudden in their class, they're starting to have mood disorders and issues. And so then somebody says, well, he has ADD. Well, he doesn't have ADD, he has a concussion,
Yeah.
So it's that kind of proposition that I look at.
It's really fascinating. We as an industry in education are moving much more closely to the notion of diagnostics through testing processes and testing procedures. And I think what I'm learning from this conversation is that whatever that diagnostic reveals, it does not reveal causality. It might reveal performance, but it does not reveal causality. Causality could be something like intellectual capacity. It could be something like a mild learning difficulty, but it could be a whole range of other phenomena as well. And I think that's a fascinating principle. I must ask you, therefore, you raised the idea there of ADHD or for want of a better word, a condition or experience like that. What is your personal interpretation of the growth in that condition?
I think it's got a lot to do with far more things than what I would call pathology. I think it's got more to do with nutrition. It's got more to do with a lack of physical exercise and movement in our children. I think it's got to do with a change in the sociological fabric of our lives, where you and I grew up probably with I can't speak for you, but for moms that you came home at lunchtime and they were there. The two-person family with the daycare situation and the children basically growing up with other people managing their lives. The ability for children to be deeply attached and connected to their parents has changed. So you get behavioral issues that are associated with that. And I think that's got way more to do with stuff. And the unfortunate thing is that when you get into it being a diagnostic approach, then there's usually a drug associated with it. And so now we're managing things with drugs, which always have side effects, which in many cases aren't positive. And a lot of these things can be solved by, in many cases, better nutrition, getting the kids moving, and potentially addressing their home life and stress and things that they're dealing with. Now, there may be the exclusive occasional one, but if you don't take a look at all those things like we talked about before, now you're drugging the kid instead of dealing with what's the truthful causal effect.
So as a father, as you are, Scott, I have to therefore ask you, with that insight and with that interpretation of what's important as a broad education experience, when you walk into a school or a college and you're thinking about that as a possibility for your daughter, what are you looking for there? And beyond that, what do you see? And what do you see maybe as the gaps, if there are any?
Well, my wife and I are struggling right now in some ways about our daughter's education because the year before last, it was clear to us that she wasn't being activated enough in school, and that there was too much downtime and not enough activity. So we went to a different school that had a more active foundation, a better physical education program, and a better, what I would call, recess structure and programming around that. Still not where I'd like it to be. So we're now discussing more and more the idea of potential homeschooling, or at least crafting measures around some of the activity-based opportunities that are at the school and getting her connected into those things without trying to over structure her day to some degree, because sometimes there's a bit of a problem with structure versus getting them to move, etc. So that's one of my problems is, as my daughter grows up here, trying to figure out what's the best adjustment for activity, education, stimulation, socialization. All those different questions come into play. And I'm reading a really fascinating book right now that my brother, who's a teacher, actually gave me years ago, called Hold On to Your Kids. And I can shoot you the reference at some point, but it's written by a physician and a psychologist probably about 20 years ago. And it really talks about the concept of attachment and how children create attachment, and their primary attachment is their parents. And what's happened socioculturally to us over the last 20 years or so is that, with the advent of more daycare, and as I had mentioned earlier, kids are losing their primary attachment to their parents and shifting it to their social network or their friends. And the problem is their social network doesn't necessarily look out for them the way their parents do. So then they start making poor decisions, and they also start reflecting in their relationship to their parents in a more push away mechanism and non-listening mechanism, just as though, as the author attributes it to, it's almost as though when you break up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend or whatever, you never really want to see them again. You don't want anything to do with them. Well, it's the same thing. When you lose that attachment to your parents, you no longer want to deal with your parents. So it's a fascinating book in terms of how you keep connected and the traditions in your life, and whether it's even having family dinner and things like that. So I think school plays a huge part in creating traditional fabric, the connection of the teacher, maintaining the connection of the parents, keeping kids active, and I think that's what's to some degree missing a little bit in some of our educational programming today.
I have so many questions there. The one I think I want to bounce back to is that in an era where I think many teachers who would listen to that, I think almost without exception, people would agree with those sentiments completely. I think where the challenge lies at the moment is that, as you said, whether it's the structuring and the assumptions around parents, within the school, teachers are being more and more singularly focused towards singular measures of what is perceived as success. So, for example, the young teacher who goes in as a science teacher or as a history teacher or as a gym teacher or whatever it happens to be, they are quite quickly indoctrinated to the idea that we are judging you as an educational body by how your students perform on a very narrow range of typically written tests. And I'm wondering that with what you're describing there, we're seeing in many ways the kind of the fallout of those ideas. And I'd be fascinated to hear your interpretation of something like that. That teachers, it's an inevitability that they have to focus down on these test results, say, or other marginal factors that might cause this interpretation. How would you feel about that?
Well, I think it's a similar problem in education as it is in almost any venue of performance. I'll sort of circumnavigate this question a little bit. When in my world of high performance sport, a lot of people now talk about evidence-based practice. And the truth of evidence-based practice is that you can't be innovative if your whole focal approach to working with an athlete or a performer is all based on previously researched evidence. For two propositions. One is that if you're using stuff that's been proven, well, you're way behind the time because it took 15 years to prove it. Meanwhile, everybody else is doing new and innovative things. And then the second proposition is that you are limiting yourself to a very, thin line of opportunity and things that you can do. So ultimately, if you want to be truly innovative and truly high performing, you have to be trying things that haven't been proven. So in the same way, I think in the educational system, we start getting into this tricky, slippery slope of let's make sure that the kids are meeting a standard, but then by making them meet a standard, you're really just keeping everybody at this common level of average. And I know I passed that book on to you about the end of average.
The end of average. Yeah.
Reading it, but it's essentially all about that. That our educational system, as we know it today, was fabricated around a structure of sort of creating a homogeneous layer of education for everybody, and everybody sort of meets that. Well, now you're no longer sort of looking at the individual capabilities and capacities of each person in the room and coaching or teaching to them. And there's going to be, different people are going to move at different speeds and have different successes earlier and later in their life. And so if you're truly being high performing and getting people to do the best that they can do, it shouldn't be something that's very homogeneous, which is what our education system unfortunately becomes when you get focused on standard tests and a certain very fixed curriculum, etc.
I think what's fascinating about what you just said there is I think a vast majority of us have that intuition, but I think what you've just done magnificently is I think you've just placed it into reason. And I would really encourage our listeners to drag that part of what you just said back and listen to that again, because for me, that is a fascinating insight. I want to drill down into a decision that's pending, Scott. You have a big decision. I don't know if it's months away, a year away, but you have Gretchen who's approaching a point where you and Jamie are going to make a call, presumably including her in the decision, about her education. Where is the line for you? Is homeschooling a real consideration for you? And what worries you about going in that direction?
Well, I think homeschooling has, we all get hamstrung by certain fears or a lack of knowledge in what is called the unknown. So once you decide to take the leap of faith to homeschool, you're now making a decision that you're going to be responsible for the education of your child. And now you have to lump that into all the other responsibilities you have on a day-to-day basis and really do your homework. And so where does that fit in your construct of prioritization in your life? Goes back to sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, if you start getting into a place where, you have to be able to put the roof over your head and pay the bills, then you start to maybe compromise certain aspects of what you need to do. So right now we're in a place where things are very good and our lives are good. But I would hate to think that my daughter's at home and then things get stressful around money or something and we're no longer focused on her education. And so so there's a bit of a, what I would call guarantee when you put them in the system that they're going to actually reach a certain level. I think the other thing is that, are you able to provide the level of stimulus, the educational support, the knowledge factor that the kid needs? My daughter goes to school in French and I speak French, but not to the level where I feel I can support her education in it. I was never great in math. My daughter's probably doing better in math right now than I did, and probably can tell me to do things I can't even tell her to do myself. So you start to get into this place. Well, what can I really help my daughter achieve what she needs to achieve? So then you have this edge. Then you have this actual knowledge curve for yourself about, well, now do I get on and figure out how to use Khan Academy or whatever other types of systems out there, such as yourselves, et cetera, to create and craft educational mechanisms for my daughter? Huge learning curve, just like everything is. So that's I would say, the fear side of things for me, or concern side of things. Then there's the socialization. There's always the question, does she get enough connection to friends, connection to people? And is that going to happen when she's homeschooled? So you're making that decision. And I think for me, we're going to base a lot of this on probably not doing it next year, but I think we're going to see how she does with one more year in the school that she's in, because she's switched schools 3 times in the last 3 years because of our moving. And I'd like to see if the school really gels with her, because I haven't lost complete faith in the educational system. And I think the key thing for me is going to be, is she thriving? And can we help her thrive at home and thrive at school, and she can get as much as she wants to get out of it? And if she is, then I think we'll keep her in the system. But
it's really fascinating. I'll give something away here as well. About 3 years ago, my 2 daughters, Anna and Georgina, they were both at the same school. They're 2 years apart, but they were 2 years apart within the same school. And I rather reactively one day, after a series of concerns at the school, actually pulled the girls temporarily out of the school. And the reason, it was very temporary. This lasted about 48 hours. It was probably more of a mood than a decision, in truth. But the primary concern we had was what I mentioned before, which was the school, through no fault of the individuals that were working there, all of whom were working very, very hard. They were almost entirely focused on testing, and testing in a very, very narrow set of challenges and outcomes. And it became deeply frustrating to me on 2 levels. One was that the narrowness and the lack of breadth of the focus and the lack of movement, as you mentioned, for example. But the other thing that I found really, really difficult about the situation was that even if I was to look at the slither of focus, the testing paradigm, I, as the parent, couldn't interact with my children's learning, because I didn't have the information to help them at home. At best, I was getting an occasional report. I was going into the school maybe once or twice a year. And I'd be interested to know your view on that. As someone that's worked as athletes learn and grow and improve, is that a fair criticism that I have for the educational system that I experienced through my children?
yeah, I think, unfortunately, anytime you get, I guess this is sort of what I was talking about when you asked me the high performance question earlier. Anytime you have to create a mechanism to serve the numbers game, you have to compromise the qualitative nature of what you deliver. So in true high performance, you have to have a very individualized approach. You have to have a true clarity on where the deficits lie in the person that you're working with or in the program that you're delivering. And you have to be able to find solution sets for all those deficits. So in a classroom of 20 or 25 or whatever the size classroom it is, you've got 25 kids who are on different levels of an educational continuum, and you have one teacher. So one teacher, sometimes the school, maybe they have an additional teacher if you're in a really special school, but you're still dealing with a 1 to 20 or 1 to 25 or 1 to 12 ratio. And so there's going to be some level of generalization, and you're going to have a certain, you're going to have to come up with ways of sort of establishing whether people are moving along the continuum of development. So then you have to come up with tests, and people have to pass them. And of course, some are going to pass them at a higher level and others aren't. And so then you're sort of pushing the herd along in different ways. But ultimately, is that serving the best benefit of each individual person in that room? No, it can't. So that is the weakness of our educational system. Now, the question then becomes like, what is the limiting factor for you to create a mechanism whereby you can overcome those limits? And that's where I think your expertise and the people you're interviewing's expertise comes into play. I know in my industry, you have to become creative in the mechanism. If you, as an example, when I worked with the Montreal Canadiens, I had 25 guys I had to train. And when I work with Olympic athletes, I have one individual athlete at a time to work with. So, you have to come up with creative means to figure out how you're going to deliver programming, how you're going to individualize that programming. And so that's what I think has to be come up with in the school system. But the, I guess, monetary side of that equation, the union side of that equation, a lot of different factors come into play on people's ability to actually overcome those things.
Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. Could you tell us then a little bit about how your approach has to differ structurally when you're working with the individual, let's say elite Olympic athlete, and you're working with the 20 to 25 hockey players, and you're developing their performance through those fitness developments. How do you effectively, as the educator in those two environments, how differently do you have to approach that?
Yeah, you have to be a lot more creative when you're working with 20 or so athletes, especially in group dynamic situations. You try to come up with mechanisms where you can have touch points that are individualized. You try to come up with mechanisms whereby you can assess in a method that takes into account all of the different elements of interest that you have in that each individual athlete's situation. And then after you've done that testing protocol, you sort of sit down and distill through it and say, what are the weaknesses of player A, player B, player C? What are the strengths? And now, based on that, when they are together as a group, you do your best, not always perfect, but your best to go after the things that you feel are weak points for each individual within a program that's constructed for a whole. So you craft or revise certain exercises or certain challenges based on certain deficits that certain athletes have. It's never a perfect situation, but it's better than just saying, well, everybody's going to come in and do the same set of exercises. But in the grind of a sports season, which is the same as the grind of a school year, some of these things do get dropped. It all comes down to prioritization and focus. And for a teacher, if they're exhausted and worn out, and there's the demands of one child who's misguided or not behaving properly, and that shifts their focus to another kid. And it's like the squeaky wheel effect in life. The kids that make the most noise tend to get the most attention, and it's the little kid over in the corner that's not saying anything, that's maybe floundering, that could flourish if they were given the opportunity.
I think there's two things in there that I really want to draw out. The first one is that you seem to be suggesting that in a group training environment, your greatest objective would be to get down to the point of individualization, which I think is completely common sense, but also really fascinating that even in that challenging environment, you seem to be trying to get down to that individual point. The other thing that I heard there was that you work with the athletes on their weakness. And I think what can often be the case in education, and a classic example of this would be something like multiple intelligence, where we denote whether a child is a better visual, kinesthetic, or auditory linguistic learner. What we tend to assume in education is we must use the strength. We must use the thing that good at. But what I draw from you is that you identify the weakness and improve the weakness. Would that be fair?
Yep. I mean, there is a classic banter out there as to whether you focus on strengths and let the weaknesses alone, or vice versa. I think the words strength and weakness are probably not your best. They're not probably the best language. I think what I try to look at are deficits that are, in my viewpoint, undermining performance. So you could have 2 or 3 weaknesses that have nothing to do with your ability to perform in that set of circumstances. And so I probably won't bother with them, but if, as an example, let's say you take a goaltender in football, and you take a midfielder in football. Well, they have different dimensions of necessary capacity and physical needs, right? One needs to stay generally in a fine movement space. They don't run a lot. They jump a lot. They explode. And then the other one tends to run a great deal, has to kick repetitively, whereas the goaltender doesn't. And so you have all these varying differences between these two individuals on the field of play. They're both footballers, but one does something different. So I'm going to look at a football goalie, and I'm going to see certain deficits that he or she may have, that I know if those are present, they're not going to play goal as well. But their aerobic capacity, as an example, might be a deficit, but doesn't really make a big difference, me working on that, in their ability to actually perform on the field of play. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And I think what's interesting as well about the language you use there is, if we take simply the words weakness and deficit, if we just consider they could potentially be the same thing, deficit makes me want to do something. It makes me want to improve the deficit. Weakness makes me want to look the other way. Now, that might just be James, I don't know, but I suspect that is a greater phenomenon. That what you're touching on there is activating language. It's language that we act on. A weakness is kind of untouchable. It's uncontrollable. Whereas I was, as you were speaking, I was listening, of course, but I was also thinking about the word surplus. A performer, if you have a surplus, it's temporary. Or at least it could be temporary, whereas a strength feels permanent. So I think that's a really interesting concept. We have relevant and perhaps some irrelevant deficits, and we have relevant and perhaps some irrelevant surpluses.
Surpluses, sure. Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it.
And I think that as a concept for educators could be a really fascinating one. I'd like to ask you, Scott. I'd like to take you back. I'll probably take you back to your childhood. It may or may not. I'd like to ask you, in your life and in your experience, who and why you consider to be a great teacher. Who in your life has provided you an educational experience that had true relevance and resonance to you as a human being, and why does that person stick out for you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I would say the first teacher that I remember really made an impact on me was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Torsman, who was my grade 7 teacher. And I think, when you're in grade 2, 3, 4, 5, your memories of education are pretty limited. But as you get into that zone of 5, 6, 7, 8, you really do remember most of the teachers that you had. And Mr. Torsman's, I think, strength was his ability to hold you accountable to the work, but to have a soft enough center and a kindness in him that allowed you to be vulnerable. So you had this sense that you could make a mistake or fail to do something that was expected, and the world wasn't going to come tumbling down. You would know that you had disappointed him, but you would not want to disappoint him, and his disappointment would not be colored on a day-to-day basis. It would be in the moment, and he would always make you feel like he cared about you. So I think that's, when I look at what makes great teachers, it's a subtle ability, and I think it's the same as great coaches. It's a subtle ability to be strong-willed and strong-minded enough to hold the person accountable to what your expectations are, but also have a warm, fuzzy place for them to fall when they do make the odd mistake, because everybody will,
It's a fascinating response. May I ask you to pronounce the gentleman's name again, please?
Torsman.
Mr. Torchman, well,
Mr. Torchman.
first of all, Mr. Torchman, we salute you. We hope you're happy, healthy, and well. I think what's really interesting there, Scott, is you didn't describe to me a technical performance of how much this man knew. You didn't speak to me about the technology he used. You didn't speak to me about how controlling or how much discipline he had. You talked there about a feeling that the man generated. And I think it's fascinating as well to reflect on the relationship between the process of learning and the affective state. I think that is very frequently undervalued in education. There's probably the worst case where the affective state is fear. And I think we all know what that can do to the true process of learning. You might get conformity, you might get command response, but the chance of truly learning is probably quite slim. But what you just described there as being held accountable, but being wanted and valued, surely must lead to a great learning experience.
Mm-hmm. I think, coaching and teaching are not dissimilar. It was interesting. I was in a program a little while ago on mindset development, and we talked about the difference between teaching and coaching. And I think fundamentally one is is somewhat didactic in the sense that you're trying to deliver information and get the person to engage in that information and learn it. And the coaching is really, there is a little bit more of a soft sort of warm fuzzy space for that, but also an accountability side to it. So I think if you're going to be a really good teacher, you also have to be a coach.
Yeah.
I don't think you can just be a teacher. I think to be a true, I guess the prof in a university in some ways would be the real classic teacher, where you're basically just presenting information and the person needs to sort of step up and figure out things themselves to some degree and self-learn. But I think in school there needs to be a little bit of a coach phenomenon there as well. So that's what sort of comes to me in that way. And I think that when you look at strong spaces in education where what makes people really learn or what makes people perform better, I think it's the sensitivity in the environment. But I think all people like to be held accountable in some way, shape, or form.
I agree.
They like to know where they stand. And so, you need to have means and methods for doing that. And it can't always be about everybody passing the test. It can be a whole bunch of different structures, but finding unique ways to create that accountability mechanism is really powerful.
I agree. It makes me think of parenting as well as professional life as a teacher. And one of the things I've always believed as an educator and as a parent is that young people thrive and succeed far, far, far more frequently when they know where the boundaries of expectation are, because then they can succeed brilliantly within the space that they have freedom within. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. Sometimes we don't make the outer boundary firm enough, and young people can drift out past that. And of course, out there, success is far trickier. Mm-hmm. I'd like you to ask a question. I'd like to ask a question to you, Scott, before we finish. And it is this: I'd like Scott to take himself 5 years into the future, and I'd like you to tell me, for that person 5 years down the line, Scott, what is the one thing that you are determined that he's going to do the same as he does now? And what is the one thing that you're determined is going to be different about that Scott 5 years down the line?
Wow, that's a good finisher. I would say I am very dedicated personally to the concept of mentorship and sharing. And so for me, I don't feel that education, teaching, mentorship, whatever your format you want to call it, is a transactional experience. I think there's a lot of expectations in mentorship or in teaching where, what energy comes back to me in some ways, or what's going to come around or go around for me. And I really, for me, what I hope I continue to do for the rest of my life is to share my knowledge and myself with people I care about and help them move forward without any expectation that it's going to be paid off in some way, shape, or form. So that's an important thing for me. And then what I hope changes is that I continue down a process that I've been on for a while now, and just get a stronger sense of my own mindset, my own set of come closer to the man I want to be, and the human being I want to be, and hopefully have more and more friends and connections and a network of people in my life that are not dissimilar to that. I think I've shared with you in the past, but I don't really care about being a super wealthy person or something like that, in the sense that I will be happy to be wealthy, but for me, my focus is on the wealth of relationships and what I do, and the energy of the work that I do, and all that stuff, and the money is kind of a side effect of that. So I think we have become sociologically too attached to a lot of net gain experiences without really having a lot of connection to the process of our personal growth and development. So that's the person I want to become.
Scott, it's fascinating, and I applaud you so, because I think I think the sharing, even within this 45-50 minutes that we've had now, and I think the way you've expressed such clear ideas and such reliable, solid ideas to many people who will listen to this, who at least theoretically are in a different industry to you. I think behaviorally it's not so different. I think what you've just described there, you're very much close to, but I also applaud you for wanting to strive further for that as well, because I think it's a key condition for a human being to grow and to learn and to develop. I want to say to our listeners, please have a look at Scott Livingston's work. First of all, his podcast on iTunes or on Shout Engine. It's called Leave Your Mark. I cannot endorse it highly enough. It is magnificent. And this is not a sort of a smarmy. I've been listening to it recently. It's great, Scott. You should be thoroughly proud of it.
Thank you.
Please also have a look at Scott with regard to his high performance sport website, and also Reconditioning HQ. Some really great ideas, some really great resources. And if you happen to be in the area of physical therapy, strength and conditioning coaching, movement dysfunction, you've got to look at Scott's work. It's fantastic. So, Scott, let's sign off. Thank you so much for taking part. It's been a genuine privilege for me. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward greatly to get to know you better, and to consider you a friend in the coming weeks, months, and years. And from all of us here at Classroom 21, we'd really like to thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, James, for having me on the show. And it's been a delight. So let's keep it going.
Perfect. Thank you.
Take care.